tides. Here's some terms to copy down in your journal. Tides is the changing levels of the oceans due to the pull of gravity by the moon. There are two different types of tides. We have high tide and we have low tide. High tide is when the water level is at its highest. So if you're at the beach and you build a sandcastle and the water starts coming in and starts washing away your sandcastle, then the tide is coming in. The water level is getting higher, which is what's called high tide. Then we have low tide, which is just the opposite, when the water level is at the lowest. So we have high tide when the water level is the highest, and then we have low tide when water level is the lowest. So on a timeline, they're at a 24-hour period through a day. 24 hours equals a day. We have 4 different tides. So if we were to take from midnight all the way to the next midnight, if we have a low tide at midnight, roughly about 6 hours later, about 6 a.m., that's when you're going to see the high tide. Then once again, about 6 hours later, about noon, that's when you're going to see the low tide. Then about 6 hours later, 6 p.m., that's when you're going to see high tide. And then back down, about midnight, you'll see the next low tide. So the tides rotate in about a 6-hour time frame. They're not always going to show up at midnight and 6 o'clock and then noon. The times change slightly every day, but they're usually about 6 hours apart. Here's a way to really view the high tides. So if we have this little pier, and here's our little fisherman fishing off of this pier. So when he's fishing off this pier, if it's high tide, he has a string going into his line going into the water. And he doesn't need a long line because the water is relatively high. So he can reach the fish very easily. Then on the flip side, he has low tide. So same pier, same fisherman, but this time look at his line. He needs a lot longer line to reach the water level because the water level is low. So it is low tide. Now the dock or the pier did not change. It stayed exactly the same. The only difference is the water level changed. Now, here's the reason that we actually have these high tide and low tide periods. Here we have the Earth, okay, and this image is from as if you were in space, looking down on the North Pole, okay? So we have the Earth, and the Earth rotates. And remember, the one rotation equals 24 hours or 1 day. So we have this rotation, and as the Earth rotates around, we also have the moon. Now, between the Earth and the moon, we have this force called gravity. And gravity pulls us and holds us to the Earth. Well, at the same time, the Earth is pulling on the moon, holding it in orbit. While the Earth is doing that, the moon is pulling back on the Earth. And when it does that, it really can't move the Earth itself because it's so small, but it can pull the water because the water flows. So what happens is the water starts to bulge or pull out when it gets close to the moon. So we have this bulge that comes out on one side, and then it bulges out on the other, almost kind of like a big bubble. So if you were here in position 1, this is where you have a larger part of the water bulging off the surface. So then you have very high tides. If you're in position 2, this is where there's not a whole lot of water bulge because all the water's being pulled towards the moon. So this would be what's considered low tide. On the far side, in position 3, it's farthest away from the moon, so you're not getting a lot of gravity from the moon, so you don't have that pull, so it gets to bubble out or bulge out. So here would be your other high tide. And then down here, position 4, once again, it's kind of halfway in between, so the water's being pulled towards the moon, so the water level is low, so it's called low tide.